Well, good afternoon. I would really like to welcome you all to this little short educational session that we're going to have today about COVID-19 vaccines. I'm Emily Poland. I'm with the Department of Education. I'm the school nurse consultant. And really what our goal is today is to help spread factual information about the COVID vaccines that are available in the United States at this point. So I also want to remind people that are watching that all things related to COVID are subject to change, that information does change. And so what we're talking about today and what is presented today is accurate as of today, February 3rd, 2021. Really like to welcome our guest, which is Kyle Massey, who has provided these sessions like this to his own community, to school nurses, and to many others across the state. And I've asked him to share his expertise to help educate our educators and our school communities in this important topic. So thank you for joining me today, Kyle, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate the introduction. So a little background on myself. I'm an infectious diseases pharmacist. I've spent the last almost year now just mired in the world of coronavirus. I worked at the Eastern Maine Medical Center, part of Northern Light Health, and there I'm not only one of their clinical specialists, but also the Antimicrobial Stewardship Program co-director. So I'm really happy and excited to be here to start to share some of this information about vaccines, and that's the case for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, at least in my mind, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, what are your thoughts on the coronavirus vaccine? Will you be getting it? It was always kind of a tough answer. There's quite a landscape of information and approvals and fast tracking of approvals and everything going on with coronavirus. It's hard to keep an eye on exactly what's happening. And so my concern had always been, when it comes time to talk about the vaccines now that they're available, what answer will I give? And trying to balance both the eye on safety for my patients, but also on trying to be a good advocate for vaccines. So I'm excited to be here because I think, given the way in which these were released, the type of data they had to support the release of these vaccines, and what we're seeing so far in their actual use in public, it's very positive, and it makes me feel very confident to come up here and say, hey, these vaccines do work, and here's why we should take them, and here's how they work, and here's how we know that they're safe. And so that's really what we'll be going through today, talking mostly about the vaccines, how they got to where they are, how do we get them approved, or in this case, emergency use authorizations for them, what else is coming down the pipeline, how effective are they, and how safe are these vaccines, and then hopefully we'll have some Q&A afterwards with Emily. I think she has some real zingers lined up for us. So I'm going to jump right into it. So some disclosures. Any views or opinions expressed in this presentation are entirely my own, and they do not represent Northern Light Health. I have not received any commercial or financial support for this program, and I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So a quick update on where we're at globally and locally for COVID vaccination. As of yesterday's numbers, worldwide, there have been 103 million doses of the available coronavirus vaccines administered. Here in the United States, it's almost 33 million doses of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And in Maine, we're at about 145,000 doses administered. So almost 10% of Mainers have received at least the first dose of the coronavirus vaccine, which is really exciting. And an important thing to understand as we go into this next part is that, like every vaccine, these are held to the same safety standards and same safety processes, just on a slightly different timeline. So that is the approval process that we're going to kind of walk through here. So a traditional vaccine approval timeline is pretty drawn out. A lot of that time is centered around identifying the right vaccine to use. So you look at a bunch of different potential targets and you see if you can get an antigen or an antibody matchup that really helps to stop the bacteria or virus or pathogen. And that's an expensive process. It's animal studies, it's making up a whole bunch of different formulations for things. And for a drug company to develop this, they really have to commit a lot of time and money. So typically they take a very conservative approach, looking at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 at a time to narrow down to what they'd eventually like to bring to trial, to human trials. And this process takes 1 to 10 years. Once they have that candidate, or maybe a couple candidates narrowed down, they move into the human trial phases. And this is where it really gets expensive. And there's a lot of red tape, a lot of paperwork, a lot of work to be done. And they break these trials up into 3 pieces. The first one is just small trials, maybe 10, 20, 30 people, all healthy adults, and they receive a dose of the vaccine and they see, is there an immune response they're looking for? And if the candidate meets their predetermined requirements in the phase 1, then they'll move on to phase 2, which is still a small trial, but now they're looking at people who are actually at risk for the disease. Maybe you have 100 participants here. And now they've started to work on the manufacturing process as well, making more and more drug to get ready for the big trials called phase 3 trials. These are the ones you hear about in the newspapers, the ones that you see on social media. They're where you get tens of thousands of participants. It's super expensive, millions and millions of dollars to run these. And so you really want to make sure that you have a most likely effective drug or vaccine candidate at that point. And as they start to roll out and recruit patients for the phase 3 trials, they really start to work on developing their manufacturing infrastructure. So this whole thing takes another 1 to 5 years. There's so many moving parts to it. And then once they get through all of this, they can move on to large scale manufacturing, commit all of the time and resources and money to building that huge infrastructure for it, and move the drug or vaccine out into the public. Now, for the COVID-19 vaccine approval timeline, it's essentially the same steps. They're just happening in a more abbreviated fashion. For the first part, the selection of vaccine targets in animal studies, as opposed to this big risk on the part of the pharmaceutical company, when they develop one of these, now they're being subsidized to some effect from the US government. It's either through direct funding to pay for their animal studies and get drugs into phase 1 or vaccines into phase 1, or it's through pre-purchasing of vaccine. In many cases, they bought a lot of doses of vaccine regardless of whether or not it became effective. And that way the pharmaceutical companies can feel confident to move forward with not just one product, but many products. And so although we only have 2 approved vaccines right now, we have probably around 30 candidates out there being developed, and that's a ton of candidates for a single disease. And so many more drugs going to phase 1, which means a much higher likelihood that something's going to make it all the way through the trials. So they go through the phase 1 trials, and then they've done some work to move these phase 1, 2, 3, this process, into kind of an overlapping manner where they take a group of patients, start administering the vaccine, and if it's effective, they take that group and move them right into phase 3 as all part of a single trial. It takes a lot of bureaucratic work out of the process as well. So what you end up getting is a very abbreviated trial timeline. And then while they're doing that, they're starting ramping up of manufacturing right from the very beginning. As soon as they've identified their vaccine target that they want to use, they start building the manufacturing infrastructure. So that 1 to 10 years now is down to months. And that 1 to 5 years is down to less than 1 year. And because we have such a large burden of disease with coronavirus right now, accumulating enough patients to meet their endpoints for the trials, super easy, and it happens very quickly. So we've taken that 10 to 15 year process, and now we're down to less than a year. Still an amazing feat to see this happen, but it's important to understand that all of those steps that are important to make sure that a drug is effective and safe are still there. They're just happening in a little bit more of a little faster of a timeline. So what did these trials look like for the 2 approved drugs or authorized drugs, Pfizer and Moderna? So altogether, about 70,000 patients were recruited between the 2 trials at a large variety of sites. So between the 2, almost 300 different clinical sites across the United States, and very diverse demographics. Typically, there's always an issue with clinical trials in that you don't get enough representative participants to represent the US population. And in this case, there was a very specific interest in making sure that there was equitable inclusion into the trials so that the diverse demographics of America are represented here. And we know how well these work, not just within one small group of the US citizens, but the larger population of the US. And so 30 to 37% were non-white participants, and that's really an admirable target that they hit. When you compare that number of participants to other trials that are out there, you'll see that this is really on par with what we see for almost every vaccine that you have. So 43,000 participants in Pfizer, 30,000 for Moderna. There's 2 other vaccines that are under a review for approval or soon will be, the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, and those accrued 43,000 and 23,000 participants respectively. When you look at currently approved vaccines, such as the high-dose influenza, you find similar or even fewer number of participants in their trials that they used to get approval. So high-dose influenza had about 32,000 participants. The Hibrix, which is Haemophilus influenza vaccine for pediatrics, about 3,000 participants. And the pneumococcal vaccines across all of the formulations had about 64,000 participants. So they really did recruit a similar number of patients. And so we get a chance to see in a similar way how safe is this vaccine and how effective is this vaccine. So now we're going to talk a little bit about those 2 pieces. What is the effectiveness of it? and what is the safety of it? So when you're talking about vaccines, you usually think of a few different endpoints or outcomes of the trials. What do we want to see if this vaccine does? That is prevent infection, which means can you even get the organism in your body? Can you even be infected with it? Prevent disease, which means if you get infected, do you actually get sick and develop symptoms? Does it prevent severe disease? So if you develop symptoms, is it bad enough that you need to go to the hospital? And can you prevent transmission? So if you get infected, can you actually pass it on to other folks? In the case of the coronavirus vaccines, in almost all trials, the primary thing that they're looking at is does the vaccine prevent symptomatic COVID-19 and also severe disease? This is important because not asymptomatic COVID-19 or non-severe disease means fewer patients in the hospital, which means our healthcare systems are less burdened. And so this is the primary endpoint that most of the studies have looked at. What that essentially means is if you have a patient who's in the trial and receives the vaccine, and here's Bob, he's one of those participants in the trial, he gets the vaccine and he doesn't develop COVID-19 at all, no symptoms, completely fine. That's not a case. So the vaccine worked. Then if you have Jill who gets the vaccine, then she gets infected with SARS-CoV-2, but she never develops symptoms, well, they'll never test, they don't test her in the trial. She has to have symptoms to be tested. So she will go as not a case. So a good sign for the vaccine, although she may potentially have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. And then if you have Beth who gets the vaccine, becomes infected, and then develops symptoms, well, that's their criteria to get tested. And so Beth would be caught and called a case. And so that would be a positive case. And the other two examples would be negative cases. So when you take those definitions and you apply them to the COVID vaccines, you get these kinds of graphs, which you may have seen on the news or you may have seen in social media. And these are what are called Kaplan-Meier curves. They show the two populations. Red is the vaccine group and blue is the placebo group. And as the line moves up that curve, that's more cases accumulating. So the blue line, the placebo, had a ton of cases, and the red line had very few cases. These are really cool graphs if you love statistics and you read a lot of clinical and medical trials, but I really like this one better. I think this applies to a much broader population. So it's the same graphic, but it has this added statistical tip at the bottom. Always try to get data that's good enough that you don't need statistics on it. And so this is the same picture. Vaccine group, very few cases. Placebo group, many cases. And so what they found in the trials is that both vaccines have greater than 94% efficacy after 2 doses for preventing that symptomatic COVID case. So it means that we know that these vaccines, if you receive it, patients who received it, rarely develop symptoms of COVID-19. And even when they did, they were much less severe. Very few severe cases in the treatment groups. But what we don't know exactly yet is, can these patients still carry the virus? They didn't look for asymptomatic cases, so we don't know. But plausibly, the answer is yes, they're able to carry the virus, but to a much lower degree than patients who don't receive the vaccine. And we see this in a ton of other vaccine trials out there. If you have antibodies present, likely you don't carry as much of the virus. And are you able to transmit the virus? Potentially, but likely that risk is very much reduced. If you have very low loads of virus in your body, the likelihood of you then transmitting it is much lower as well. So we don't have the exact answers to these, but we hypothesize that most likely, yes, you can carry it, you carry much less, and you have a lower likelihood of transmitting. Both Pfizer and Moderna are studying those questions, and we'll have more answers to that as we get further into the vaccine world. So the next piece is, are the mRNA vaccines safe? So when I try to think of drug safety or vaccine safety from a pharmacist standpoint, I think of 3 things typically. What's the theoretical harm? So how does the drug work? And does the way in which it works make me concerned that there are some side effects or safety things I need to be looking for? What's in the drugs or vaccines? And then what was reported in the trials, which is always the best indicator of what to expect in your patient population. So to talk about the theoretical harm, first, let's talk just a little bit about how these actually work. So what is mRNA? Well, RNA and DNA are very similar products in your body. DNA is like the cookbook for the human body. It has the recipes for everything in your body, and it's housed safely inside the nucleus of your cell. And that nucleus is basically like Fort Knox, really hard to get in and out. You have to have specific mechanisms in place for something to enter the nucleus and interact with DNA. RNA, on the other hand, is small copies of the DNA, little pieces, like basically recipes for individual proteins. Typically, copies are made within the nucleus, and then they're carried outside of the nucleus into the rest of the cell. And then these chefs, as I call them, or ribosomes, pick up those copies of the DNA, the mRNA, and then make proteins out of it. In the case of the coronavirus vaccine, those proteins it's making, that recipe, is for a part of the virus called the spike. It's on the outside of the virus, and it's what helps the virus attach the cells in your body. These pieces that the vaccine helps to make then teaches your immune system how to create antibodies that target and stick to that spike. And those antibodies then make it not only harder for the virus to work because it's blocking the ability of it to bind to your tissue, but it makes it easier for your immune system to identify it and remove it from your body. So essentially it looks like this in the body. You get injected with the mRNA vaccine, which is this little segment of mRNA housed inside this lipid bubble that helps it get into your body, not break down too quickly, and then connect and attach to your cell. And those little mRNAs get dropped off into the outside part of your cell outside of the nucleus. So they never enter the nucleus. They're just in the outside, the cytosol of the cell. And then your ribosomes see those, pick them up, and start to make those spike protein pieces. Now, mRNA naturally degrades in the body. We're constantly producing it, so it constantly goes away, and we have mechanisms for that. The mRNA from the vaccine typically disappears within a few hours to a few days. So a few days after receiving the vaccine, there will be none of the components of the vaccine left in your body, and all you have left now is this developing immune response. So those pieces that are made within your cell are then moved to the outside of the cell, where your immune system sees them, learns what they are, and then starts to create antibodies so that if you become infected with the virus, it already knows what to do and knows what to target, and you start making antibodies to block that virus from entering your body or help to get it out of your body. So from a theoretical harm standpoint, there's no live virus in it. The mRNAs and proteins that they make are all natural part of the body process. So we're not introducing something that your body isn't already doing. It can't interact with DNA because it has no mechanism to get into the nucleus. And the contents of the vaccine disappear within a few hours to a few days. And the immune response that you get from this targets very specific parts of the virus. And it's the same immune response you would expect to get from natural immunity. So any concern that you might have around how your immune, the antibodies that are formed, are the same antibodies you'd get from natural immunity. But in this case, you don't have to go through the risk of infection, and you get a much stronger response than you would get from natural immunity. So the second piece I'd look at is what's in the vaccines. So both vaccines have the mRNA and the lipids. They both have a substance called polyethylene glycol, which helps keep the vaccine stable. So it lasts longer, so you can get it into people's arms, as you can administer it. This is a substance that you find in a lot of over-the-counter and prescription medications, including Tylenol, Zyrtec, and ibuprofen. So it's something we know a lot about and we use in a lot of applications. And they both contain sugar. The Pfizer vaccine, basically, the rest of it, is like Gatorade. It's a bunch of electrolytes. And the purpose of those electrolytes are just to make that injection more tolerable so it doesn't burn or hurt when you get it. And these are all electrolytes that you find in Gatorade, food, drinks, etc. The Moderna vaccine has a few buffers, which also help to make the injection more tolerable. And these are similar to things, these are the exact same substances that we find in a variety of other medications like eye drops, other injectables, ear drops, etc. And so all of these substances are well known, well studied, and well tolerated. So from a content standpoint, there's not really a big safety concern that comes out. So finally, we get to what do we see in the trials, and that's where we start to talk about the side effects. Now, side effects are common with all vaccines, and the reason we have side effects is because the purpose of vaccines is to ramp up our immune system and teach it how to fight something. And when your immune system ramps up, that's what causes side effects. When you get the flu, what's making you sick with the flu isn't the virus, it's your immune response to that virus. So that's why with a lot of these vaccines, you get flu-like symptoms because your immune response is doing roughly the same thing. Just in this case, you don't actually have to get infected with a virus to have that immune response. So here is a table that shows the rate at which you have certain side effects with the Shingrix or the shingles vaccine. Compared next to it is the COVID mRNA vaccines. And you can see the Shingrix, if you've had that, is a vaccine that you get a really strong immune response from. And you have a lot of these flu-like symptoms, but at a similar rate that we see with the COVID vaccine. So pain, redness, and swelling, muscle pain, fatigue, headaches, chills, and fever. Predominantly mild, but both common in both vaccines. So the side effects that we see are expected, and they fit with the type of vaccine it is. Now, these are both common and also typically mild. Very few severe side effects happen. So although 78% of patients experience pain, very mild pain. So, like a pinch in the arm or something along those lines. And same with the rest of the side effects. They're more frequent with the second dose of the vaccines for both the Pfizer and the Moderna. And this little graph on the right here shows each of those same categories, and then it's color coded. It's just easier to look at colors than a whole bunch of percentages all stacked up next to each other. And here, red doesn't mean like it's going to hurt a lot. Again, it just means it's more common. So you can see that for all of these side effects, most of them are occurring more frequently in the second dose versus the first dose. The onset of them is usually within the first 24 hours, and they usually go away within 1 day up to 3 days. Very rarely lasting beyond 3 days. So mild, come on quickly, and disappear quickly. Anecdotally, most of my colleagues and friends and family out there that have received the vaccine, usually around 12 hours, 24 hours, where most of them have had side effects, where they started to feel the side effects. So what to expect when you're getting the vaccine. So day 1, you'll get your first dose, or day 0 by this graph, receive your first dose. Within the first 24 hours, you may start to experience side effects, again, mostly mild and lasting less than 3 days. Then 21 or 28 days later, if you're receiving the Pfizer or the Moderna, you'll get the second dose. And again, side effects more common at this point, but again, mild and resolving within 1 to 3 days. And then once you've gotten both doses, now you have that greater than 94% efficacy in preventing symptomatic COVID. So even if you get the virus, you're much less likely to have a severe outcome and much less likely to have symptoms in the first place. So you've gotten your second dose. Now it's effective. Now you continue to follow public health guidance. And as we start to get more and more of the population vaccinated, we'll start to move towards this next phase of virus pandemic response, where we may see some of those changes to public guidance. But right now, even with the high effectiveness, you still follow public guidance after vaccination. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the side effects that you get with the COVID vaccines can look just like COVID itself. So fatigue, headache, fever, chills, and body aches, those are all side effects of the vaccine, but also signs and symptoms of COVID. So there's a few warning signs and symptoms to keep in mind. And these are good reasons to think, oh, maybe I should go get tested or talk with one of my providers. And that includes cough, sore throat, shortness of breath, or loss of taste and smell. None of those should happen with the vaccine, but all of those can happen with COVID. The last piece here is touching on allergies and other conditions where you may be concerned or have questions around receiving the vaccine. First thing to note is that the only condition where there's a clear contraindication to receiving the vaccine is if you have a known anaphylactic allergy to any of the components I listed earlier that are in either of the vaccines. If you have one of those, you definitely shouldn't receive the vaccine. Now, if you have a history of severe allergic reactions to other medications, other injectables, there's a recommendation to have a little bit of a longer observation time after you receive the vaccine, but still recommend that you receive it. In the CDC's follow-up over the last 2 months of vaccine administration, over 30 million doses given, and through that 30 million, there was somewhere around 10 anaphylactic reactions, 10 to 20 anaphylactic reactions that were recorded in their data tracking system. Now, anyone that gets this vaccine and anyone that administers this vaccine has to monitor for these things and has to report them to the FDA. So there's a pretty good reporting system in place to track these. So based on their data they had, and after reviewing those cases individually, the rate that they've noted anaphylactic reactions occurring is somewhere around 2.5 to 5 per million doses given. That's a very rare, very low rate of occurrence. So certainly still a concern, but not really above where we see the rates of anaphylactic reactions with a lot of other medications out there. So the recommendation is, even if you have that history, you still get the vaccine, and we'll monitor closely. The other conditions, immunocompromised conditions, the recommendation is if you have an immunocompromising condition, you can still receive the vaccine. Generally speaking, the concern is around how effective the vaccine will be if your immune system doesn't work as well, and less so about safety. Generally, I say, if you've been told, if you have an immunocompromising condition and you've been told you can receive the flu vaccine, you can get the shingles vaccine, you can get the pneumococcal vaccine, then you can receive the COVID vaccine. But when in doubt, you can always talk to whomever your provider is for your condition. Pregnant patients weren't studied in the trials. However, the risk associated with having COVID while pregnant versus the theoretical risk of receiving the vaccine, the recommendation is that patients who are pregnant can make that decision and decide to get the vaccine. The theoretical side of it, there's very low theoretical concern. There's no ingredients in there that would be concerning. The Moderna vaccine has fetal toxicity data from their preclinical trials. It shows it doesn't appear to be a concerning interaction, at least there. But of course, we don't have a ton of data in the human population yet. There were 23 patients in the trials that became pregnant. And to date, there's around 2,000 pregnancies that have occurred and are being monitored in patients who have received the vaccine. So we're slowly accruing more and more data. But in all cases, the risk that comes with getting the virus is much higher than the theoretical risk that may come from getting the vaccine. And then finally, breastfeeding. The antibodies can always cross into breast milk, but there really is no concern that's known or theorized for breastfeeding after you receive the vaccine. So the recommendation is you can still get the vaccine. You don't need to withhold breastfeeding after getting the vaccine. All right, so that is the fun walkthrough of the 2 available coronavirus vaccines and update on where we're at. Obviously, there's more vaccines coming, and we'll have more information about those as we move forward in this whole process. I've listed some links here that are useful to stay up to date with questions and information that are out there. The first one is the Northern Light FAQ for the public. This is updated regularly by myself and some of my colleagues. The next few are from the Maine CDC that has a wealth of great information. And then finally, once you get the vaccine, the VSafe registry is a public registry where you can go sign up for it after you get the vaccine and you can report your side effects. And it's a really helpful tool from the government and public and clinical aspect to keep track of what people are reporting and what they're seeing after receiving the vaccine. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and pass it back over to Emily and go on to the next section.
All right, thanks so much, Kyle. I'm going to start with something you didn't actually even touch on, which was, can you tell us how maybe the priority for, or who is a priority for the vaccine is determined? Do you know that process?
That's a great question, Emily. So the CDC, in collaboration with the ACIP, which is a group that helps to approve and make recommendations for vaccine use in the US, along with a group of stakeholders from the public, private, and medical sectors, kind of got together and they started to build out a list of phased approach and basing that on the idea of who's at the highest risk, who would benefit the most early on in vaccination. There's been a ton of conversation around equitable distribution of the vaccine as well, and making sure that we're getting this to disadvantaged populations and giving them the same opportunity to get vaccinated as advantaged populations. But ultimately, the federal government has left that decision up to the individual states, and each of the states do have a better idea of what does their population look like, how many doses they have, what can they move into. So right now in Maine, we're in the first part of phase 1B, which means we've moved past all of the healthcare and first responders and moved into this higher risk category. Right now, we're vaccinating Mainers over the age of 70, and potentially over the next few weeks, we'll start to move into the 65 to 69 population, as well as those with certain medical conditions that put them at higher risk. But that's still up in the air, and we don't have clear answers. And a lot of that's going to be dictated by just how much vaccine we're able to receive and whether or not we have enough for these populations we're going to expand to.
Do we know if there's going to be enough vaccine for everybody?
Yeah, that's another great question. That's one that I can't give you the answer to. But what we do know is that there are millions of doses being produced by Pfizer and Moderna. Of course, we have billions of people to vaccinate around the world. With the addition of Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Novavax is another manufacturer, pharmaceutical company that's bringing a vaccine to market. I think we're going to have enough vaccine. Now, when we get to the general public, which vaccine you end up receiving is kind of a question mark. But I think we'll keep up with demand. We'll be able to vaccinate. And at the rate we're vaccinating right now, if we maintain the supply, the majority of the population would probably be vaccinated. I think the projections right now are into the late spring, midsummer timeframe.
Do you have any information about vaccines for children? I know that the 2 that are out there right now are not approved for children under 16. So is there one coming?
Yeah, another great question. You got a lot of great questions, Emily. So the Pfizer vaccine did include pediatrics age 16 to 18. There was about 100 or so participants in that age group. So not a huge population, but they were included in there. Both Pfizer and Moderna, and as far as I'm aware, any of the other vaccines that have received approval so far, all have ongoing studies in children occurring now. So many of them are recruiting currently, children under the age of 18 to include in their studies. And from what I've heard, those are likely to have results available in the later spring, maybe summer timeframe.
So what about when I get my first dose and I have side effects and I feel pretty bad afterwards? Should I still get the second dose?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we like to say if you're feeling really bad, the vaccine must really be working because your immune system is really getting ramped up. Now, there's certain cases where you might have concerns about getting the second dose. So if you had a severe allergic reaction to the first dose, that's certainly a scenario where you may want to talk to your healthcare provider before moving on to the next dose. Certainly, if you've had allergic reactions, they can give you Benadryl and steroids and other Benadryl and other drugs to help minimize that while you get the vaccine. But if you've had headache, fever, muscle aches, things like that, that's all signs that the vaccine is working and you should get the second dose.
So it doesn't mean that the vaccine gave me COVID.
That is correct. There is no live virus in this vaccine. It's physically impossible for this vaccine to give you COVID. It might make you feel like it for 24 hours or so, but it can't give you COVID.
What about that mRNA? Does that stay in your body for a long time?
Yeah, so mRNA actually breaks down in the body pretty rapidly. You have enzymes, little machines in your cells that for all of that mRNA you normally produce, it's just in there chomping away at it. And mRNA typically lasts minutes to hours. The mRNA from the vaccine lasts a little bit longer, partially because of that lipid bubble around it and the way that it was made. But the mRNA from the vaccine degrades within a few hours to a couple days. So after a few days, there's essentially none of that left in your body.
Now, this is a little strange, but I have heard people say that the vaccine might cause infertility. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So there was a former Pfizer employee from many years ago who had posted on social media a concern around whether there was cross-reactivity between the antibodies that are produced after you receive the vaccine and a placental protein called syncytin. There's no data to support that. It comes from the idea that there is a small shared genetic sequence between the syncytin protein and the spike protein. The process of an antibody binding to a protein, though, is very complex and requires a lot of different pieces to all match up and line up. It's like a super complex puzzle piece. A single shared genetic sequence would not be enough to cause that cross-reactivity. I think an important piece to think about with this too is if that were the case, if the COVID vaccine could cause infertility from this binding to a placental protein, we would see the same effect occurring with natural infection. And so to date so far, there's been no reports of widespread infertility after natural infection. So there doesn't seem to be any basis to really support this claim.
Great. All right, another strange but frequent question is that I hear is about whether or not fetal cells were used in the development of the vaccine, because some people have concerns about that.
Yeah, this is a question that's received a lot of unfortunate twisting, I believe. There's a very real and understandable concern out there, especially from secular groups, around the use of fetal tissue or fetal material in the production of anything. And pro-life groups and those who support pro-life groups certainly have a very real ideological reason to want to answer this question. I think that's been twisted a lot to whether or not we're just putting fetuses into the vaccine. I think that's an unfortunate mishmash of a very real concern. So the use of fetal tissue comes from a few cell lines that we grow in a lab that were originally harvested from aborted fetuses back in the 1970s. There's two that are commonly used, and a lot of laboratories use these because they're really easy to maintain, really easy to grow, and they're great for testing viruses. Some of the vaccines out there have used these fetal cell lines to develop their vaccines and manufacture their vaccines, and some haven't. There's some really great organizations out there that post a list of the currently developed vaccines and whether or not they use fetal cell lines in their process. and I can share that out. I don't think I have it in the presentation here. But for those that have a very real concern, you can find that information. Now, there are a lot of bioethics groups out there, both secular and non-secular, that provide guidance on what to do in a scenario where the only vaccines that are available are those that may have been made with fetal cell lines. And the general recommendation from most is that it is ethically appropriate to receive the vaccine if it is the only option available for a disease. Now, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine used fetal cell lines early in testing the different strains to decide which one to use, but don't use any for manufacturing or development. So they all use non-fetal lines. And regardless of whether they use it for testing and development or for manufacturing, it never requires harvesting of new fetal tissue. It's always these same cell lines originally harvested back in the 1970s. So there's no new interaction or harvesting of fetal tissue, regardless of whether or not they use those lines.
Okay. So moving ahead, Mike, I got two last questions for you. One about now that I've received the vaccine. So if one, what happens if I don't get the vaccine? And I guess if I do get the vaccine, will I still have to wear a mask?
Yeah, great question. So if you don't get the vaccine, well, you'll remain at risk for COVID, which means one, that not only can you get COVID, you can also spread COVID to others. And the general idea behind vaccination is moving towards herd immunity, and the immunity that you get from these vaccinations, by all measurements, scientific and non, is what we call a superhuman immunity. So you can develop an immune response and a protective effect from this very concentrated vaccination that you cannot get from natural immunity. So where natural immunity is only providing so much protection and tends to wane over time, we anticipate that the immune response that you get from the vaccine is well beyond that and will persist for longer than that. So they're still developing and studying that piece of it. But during the trials, they had many patients in both vaccine trials who had previously had COVID-19, and they ended up in both the vaccine and the placebo arms. And those are the previous history of COVID-19, and the placebo arms tended to get COVID again at about the same rate as folks who didn't have a history of COVID. So you do get an additive protective effect. And so it's recommended, whether you have a history of COVID or not, to still get the vaccine. And then the second part of that question, I'm sorry, what was the second part of that question?
Will we still be wearing masks? How long will we be wearing masks?
Yep. So we talked a little bit about what endpoint they studied in these trials. And so some of that we're still learning, how much does this actually prevent transmission? Regardless, even a very, very effective vaccine, even if you only get infected 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 1,000,000 times after you get the vaccine, if you have a ton of virus circulating in the community, that's a ton of exposures for you. And so there's still a good chance that you could end up with the virus. So even after you get the vaccine, using masking and social distancing is recommended, because all of these are an additive benefit in reducing the overall transmission in the community. And as we get to a lower community transmission rate, then we can start to scale back on these. And the federal government's really going to drive that train. So the recommendation is follow the advice from the federal government. And as we see decreases in transmission, we'll hopefully start to see changes and movement back towards a more normal social interaction.
And that's what we're all hoping for, isn't it? Thank you so much, Kyle, for agreeing to do this with me today. And I hope that it helps others have a better understanding of the vaccines.
Happy to do it. And thank you so much for having me.
Right. Thanks.